You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 241 of the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, Ben Eagle. Now, yesterday, the 21st of April, was World Curlew Day. And I must say, curlews are one of my personal favourite birds, having spent much of my life on the Essex coast. And today's episode is partly about celebrating the curlew, but also discovering a new farm and farmer, although I'm guessing quite a few of you will know her already. We're heading to the Yorkshire Dales today to meet Leigh Weston, who farms with her partner Neil Heseltine near Malham. The farm is around 1,200 acres in total, including rented and owned land. In terms of altitude, the land rises from 800 feet above sea level to 1,800 feet. The couple keep a 40-strong calving herd of belted Galloways and 40 Wensleydale sheep, and it's managed very much with biodiversity in mind, including curlews, as we'll hear about today. And I should say that Leigh is also an ambassador for Curlew Action. And I want to thank Curlew Action for working with me to get in touch and ask us to make this program today. Leigh, welcome to Meet the Farmers. How are you doing?
Hi Ben, thanks for inviting me on board and Curlew Action. It's brilliant. Yeah, I'm good today. We've had a really rough day in Malham yesterday. We had every bit of weather that nature could throw at us, but today it's blue sky and sunny, so we're all fairly delighted.
Oh, you're blue sky. Well, we've got grey skies and wet in Norfolk, so it's I'm glad that it's not raining somewhere in the country.
Yeah, it's been, I think, universally, we're all pretty upset with how the weather's been for the last month. But yeah, just seeing a bit of blue sky today and a bit of sunshine and a bit of warmth in it is, yeah, making us feel like spring is on its way.
Good. Yeah, let's hope so. I think for the sake of everyone, it needs to be. Let's dive straight in. Tell us a little bit about the farm, first of all, in terms of the landscape, also some of the nature that you have on the farm and the business in general, how it came about.
Yeah, so we farm in a village called Malham in the Yorkshire Dales National Park. Malham is an extremely famous village. It's famous for its scenery. It's extremely beautiful. We have lots of visitors to the area in terms of tourists who come for the day, but also people who stay longer and have holidays here. We're an upland farm. We are considered to be severely disadvantaged above the moorland line. But we have some great habitat on the farm. We have triple SIs. It's upland pastures, botanically diverse. We have upland hay meadows, and we're lucky to have ground nesting birds like curlew, but also other waders, skylark, meadow pipit, redstart, and just some amazing species of plant and flower in our limestone pastures, which is pretty, some of them are pretty rare species now and difficult to find elsewhere. So yeah, we're very privileged to have them.
Yeah, and you are, as I mentioned in the intro, you're this mix of some of the land you own, some of the land you're renting from other landlords. So I mean, is there some family history in the area?
Yeah, there is. So the farm has been farmed by both sides of Neil's family historically as tenant farmers for a very long time. His mum and dad managed to buy the farm in the 1980s, which was obviously a really difficult time financially, the 80s. You know, there was a
Yeah.
big crash. They went through some hard times, nearly lost everything, but yeah, they managed to buy it. And that has obviously been a brilliant thing for Neil as their child. He's one of five kids and he's the one that's taken it forward. So for him, it's obviously been a brilliant thing that his parents were able to do that for him. That's the sort of history of it. And I guess some of the land is owned, but actually that is now outweighed by rented land. We rent a lot from private landlords. One of those landlords is the National Trust. But I think we have four now landlords of either private individuals or organizations like the trust. So yeah, it's a real mix of ownership and rent.
Yeah, and I assume a lot of those agreements have come about through them, in essence, seeing what you've been doing on the rest of the land and them coming on.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think the historically we were actually quite an intensive sheep system with Swaledale Hill sheep, which is more probably traditional in the area, certainly 20 years ago. And there was an opportunity to go into a pilot scheme for HLS, which was called the Limestone Country Beef Project. And I just met Neil at that time, and he decided to go into this pilot scheme. There was a financial incentive to do so, and it meant selling some sheep to buy cattle. And we started with 19 heifers and a bull, and we're now actually up to almost 200 head of cattle. So that scheme for us was very much the start of a journey that pushed us into something much more environmental, still producing animals, still farming, but a much more environmental take on that and taking some of the pressure out of the farm. And that pilot scheme started because there was an identification in the uplands that the sheer numbers of sheep had caused an issue with overgrazing, which obviously has its implications for water and how quickly water leaves us, but also in terms of the botanical flora was being lost. And it was becoming a very one-dimensional grass sward rather than grass, herbs, flowers, those sorts of things. So yeah, that's where the outwintered cattle came in, scheme came in.
Okay. Just going back to you for a bit. Did you grow up with farming?
No, not at all. I don't think I'd ever really been on a farm, maybe once on holiday in Scotland where we went to a farm and petted some sheep, which I loved at the time. No, I grew up in a town called Wallsend, which is about 3 miles outside of Newcastle in the northeast. Wallsend is in North Tyneside, and it's a town that is actually quite famous globally for its shipbuilding and coal mining.
Yeah, of course.
The shipyards there have built some amazing, famous ships like HMS Ark Royal, HMS Illustrious. And growing up in Wallsend was a real thing, actually. You always felt like those ships were really important. There was a lot of employment in primary industry and shipbuilding. But when all that stopped, there's been a certain amount of economic decline, and Wallsend is an absolutely brilliant place. And culturally, I still very much I identify as a Geordie, and I have a real pull in my heart between rural and urban, and
Okay.
Newcastle and Malham and the Dales. So I'm very lucky, I think, to have that upbringing and have family there and still be able to go back and spend time in Newcastle because I'm not too far away, but also live a very rural life where I'm involved in the landscape and involved in farming.
Yeah. How did you find it sort of coming into the farming community?
Yeah, it was great. And I remember thinking at the time, I kind of was an outsider and still am an outsider to some degree, but I don't mind that really. I quite enjoy that. And I like Neil's dad came from Wensleydale to Malhamdale, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I, he was always an off-Cumden to some degree. And he'd been sort of here, I don't know, 70, 80 years. Yeah, but I remember it feeling very welcoming, and I think it's an easy shoe in when you meet a local and they bring you into their community. But yeah, really friendly, people's willingness to help each other and do some good when things aren't so easy. That capacity for goodness, just always found amazing, really. And I always thought the social life was really interesting and diverse. I was like used to going out in Newcastle and partying and drinking and loved it, and it was brilliant. But then came here and it was different. It was
Yeah.
cricket dinners and balls and a whole different ball game of things. So yeah, my boob tubes and high heels raised a lot of laughter and eyebrows, I think, in the beginning.
And the farm itself, and how you and Neil, I suppose, have thought about it, as you're thinking in terms of as the years have gone on and the way you've managed it, has that shifted over time?
Yeah, definitely. The pilot scheme that I talked about, the Limestone Country Beef Project, I think that was a real eye opener because we physically saw the change in the land very quickly in
Yeah.
terms of the flowers and plants. Then you see pollinators and birds, and things started to change with the cattle. And we still had sheep, we still had a lot of Swaledale sheep, but things were just changing. And then we saw the change in the finances, and actually that the cows had very little labor or inputs. They were a totally grass-based system. They were just grazing the hills all year round. There was no cost to them whatsoever, really, other than the initial buying of them. And they became profitable in their own right, whereas the sheep were taking a huge amount of inputs. We were feeding a lot of concentrates to get lambs to the right size, to keep sheep going through the winter, a lot of supplementary stuff going on, and a high cost, sort of more input based system. So, yeah, things started to change from then on. And I think I was always very interested in nature and wildlife, and had sort of been lucky enough to grow up where I'm from in Wallsend. There's an old coal mine called the Rising Sun. It was the Rising Sun Colliery, and it became a country park in the 1970s. And I spent a lot of time there. We spent a lot of time there. And there's a bird pond and all sorts of stuff, lots of trees. And it's an amazing habitat to this day. And I've spent a lot of time there as a child and over the years. And I think almost being here gave me license to further that really and get even
Okay.
more interested in nature and wildlife really. So the two just sort of carried on. But I have to say, amongst it all, Neil's interest and his farming interest was always about sheep. He was so driven by sheep and breeding mule gimmer lambs,
Right.
and that's what he thought about all the time, just getting them big enough to show, being competitive and all of those things. So that was still a major driving force for him. And the change has been very gradual into something that's quite different, I would say, but still farming and still mindful of producing food from the uplands, but doing it in a way where part of that food production is the creation and management of some habitat as well.
Yeah. I'm interested in your thinking on how many other farmers in the uplands have sort of shifted their way of thinking, because especially if you look at what's happened over the last few years, if you look at the growth of things like nature-friendly farming network, interest in regenerative ag, um, what's your sort of finger on the pulse in terms of the direction of farming in the uplands?
I mean, I could only speak sort of as I see things here in the Dales. I don't think there's been a huge, I think we're seeing more cattle outside over winter. And it's really important to stress, I think, the importance of cattle being outside over winter is obviously a financial one, because if they're outside on the hills grazing and you've got enough grass for them to go at, and that's obviously a careful balance of stocking rate of how many cows you have on that piece of land at any one time. But if they're not in a building and you're not needing to buy bedding and use fuel in a machinery to get bedding to them, etc., you're really lowering your costs. But the other side of that is the environmental benefit that comes from having cows outside. And I think cows get a hard time sometimes. People are very sometimes anti-cow, like they're the antithesis of environmental conservation. Actually, cows within our system play the most important role, in the sense that what they're doing over winter, when we just see them outside grazing the hills, they're removing all that tough, thick, rank grass that they can convert into really great belted Galloway beef. And what they leave behind is obviously SH1T dung that, beetles, flies, invertebrates love. That's a level of fertilizer, but also they leave the space behind for wildflowers and herbs and grasses to come through in May. So once we start taking them off, shutting everything up in May, we then see an abundance of wildflowers coming through. So it's a twofold thing. And to go back to your original question, I think we are seeing a few more cattle out on the hills through winter. I think predominantly the Dales is still a sheep farming area. Other people can probably answer this better than me. There maybe are less sheep about. I don't know. I think there are areas that look, and even when we've travelled in the Lake District a little bit, I think there are places that look like there's longer grass and they don't look as short grazed as they used to be. So I think maybe things are changing a little bit, but it's hard to quantify actually.
As we're marking World Curlew Day, let's turn towards curlews. Firstly, I suppose, why are curlews such a special bird for you?
Yeah, they're really evocative, I think, of spring, and I think waiting for them to come back from the coast from where you are. And actually,
Yeah.
we know some of the birds in the dales. There was actually one this time. There's some been GPS tagged, and one came down to the wash. All of the rest went west, and one went east for winter.
Huh.
Um, we wait for them coming back from the coast, and they are spring. And I think anybody who's heard the curlew call, that bubbling call, and
Yeah.
it is such a sound of the hills. And I think they were really quite commonplace even 30 years ago. And I think they're in decline, and we know they're in decline. And I think for me, they weren't a bird I knew very well before I lived in the uplands. And now I think I've lived in the uplands for 20 years. I wouldn't like to think about the landscape without them, if that makes sense. Just that herald of spring, knowing that that bird has traveled all the way back here to nest. I think it has a right to be on the land and a right to succeed in breeding. So for me, they've become a bird that I really want to succeed here on our land. And I know that if I help curlews, I can help so many other species. There's a whole ecological system that supports a curlew. And that comes down to insects and invertebrates, flowers, everything that those insects feed on. If I have a healthy ecosystem, I can support a curlew. So it's a curlew, but it means so much more than that ecologically, I suppose.
I should just say, for anyone who doesn't know that iconic sound of the curlew, here it is. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about the curlews on your farm, and what you're doing, I suppose, to encourage them.
Yeah, so we have curlews in, I suppose we have different habitats within the farm, and that's a really important point to make. I think if you curlews coming to our farm 15 years ago, 20 years ago, would have seen a predominantly quite short grazed system that didn't really grow that much. The hay meadows that we had weren't as diverse as we have now. I think now what they'll see is land that is wetter because a lot of the improvements that were done in the 90s, like drainage in the meadows, has been allowed to block up. So now we have wetter areas. We have diverse hay meadow, which has been restored. So they will see places they can have cover in hay meadows. They will see wetter areas where they've got a beak about this long, so they can get that beak down into the mud and pull out invertebrates. They'll see areas of upland pasture that is some of it is short grazed. So that's great for chicks once the nest is on the ground and the chicks have hatched for them to get out into those more open areas. They've got tiny little beaks and get them out to feed. But then also some tussocky areas, some rushy areas that provide essential cover for those chicks to shelter from weather, but more importantly, escape predators. So yeah, I think that's what they'll find on our farm. So we have curlews that nest in true uplands, in pastures, but near hay meadows. And then we actually have some that actually nest in hay meadows themselves, which provide a huge amount of cover.
When you mentioned drainage being one issue, perhaps with your ambassador for Curlew Action hat on, why curlew's threatened? What are the issues?
It's complex. The curlew has been sadly a victim of things moving on very quickly, and their decline has actually been very quick. We had a very buoyant population in the 90s, and the changes that we've seen, it's some of it is landscape management, and it's from every direction. And I don't want to point the finger at anyone here. That's not what it's about. But I think certain areas have seen huge commercial forestry plantations. That's probably maybe more Scotland, where you get just land that was previously open upland, probably, for graze and not a huge amount of value, but will have been grazed. That's been planted in commercial forestry, literally nowhere for them to nest. Or predators love sitting in the top of trees and looking down on nests. So they've lost that habitat. The same with some peat bog. And we know peat bog has been a habitat that struggled as well. Curlews really like peat bog because it's wet. In the farmed landscape, some has been drained, and now some of our farm was drained. Um, so not as many places they can feed and get the beaks in. And then in terms of hay meadow management, obviously some of that has gone into silage. So if you've got a curlew that comes back, and curlews are really, really loyal to the nest sites. They're very long-lived birds. They can live anything, we've got records of birds living 17, 18, but even up to 30 years nationally.
Wow, I didn't know
So
that.
those birds are very loyal to the nest sites. They're not evolutionary programmed to change quickly. So they keep coming back to the nest site that they had ages ago because they know they had success there. And then suddenly they come back from the coast. Oh, instead of it being cut for hay, we can nest in it. So we come back, we nest, we get chicks off the ground, and that happens all the way through from April through to July. Well, actually, it's no longer a hay meadow. It's being cut for silage, and it's been cut 3 times. So that first nest might get destroyed, or the chicks might get destroyed. The adult either gives up and goes back to the coast, or maybe it'll have a second try, but maybe then there's another cut of silage. And I would really stress that this is not about pointing the finger, but I think it highlights the farm pressure as well, the pressure farmers are under to produce more. And sometimes that comes from all directions. That might come from a buyer or something. This is how you need to farm to produce this much to supply your contract. So it's just all of those things. And I think sometimes the upland system we have, say, our sheep system, would have favoured predators then, like lots of hard grazing, short grass.
Yep.
Predators can see everything. We were feeding a lot of sheep cake, and a lot of those feeders were surrounded by crows and gulls, whatever. And I think we've almost created a landscape that is quite predator friendly. And the sort of predators have thrived in it, and the balance all the time is just shifting in favor of the predator rather than the curlew. And I think if we can just tweak habitat a little bit and maybe put some more things in favor of the curlew, and I'd say that we're not just talking about curlews here, we're talking about lots of ground nesting birds.
Yeah.
Um, Lapwings, they all need something different, but lots of waders nest on the ground. So yeah, I think it's just about shifting things back in favor of the curlew. And I think all that bird needs is to get one chick away every other year to be viable, and it's not even doing that. We need to help it to be more successful at breeding. And I don't have all the answers, but there's lots of people who are working to help. We've got the Curlew Recovery Project, and we've got Curlew Action, who are a real PR voice for the curlew. But we obviously need Natural England, DEFRA, all of the other stakeholders in the landscape to keep talking to each other and keep trying to find solutions to some of the challenges that are faced, whether that be practical stuff on the ground or whether that's in terms of a shift in payments to maybe influence how we all farm. I don't know, but I think that's where we're at.
Yeah. I mean, for farmers listening who might be in the right place and they want to hear more curlews, see more curlews on their land, what could they do? Is there anyone who you would point them towards, or any actions you would point them towards?
Yeah, I think there's a few sort of angles to come at on that. Yeah, Curlew Action have done some absolutely brilliant work over the last few years, getting curlews into all of our psyche in terms of land managers, so farmers, gamekeeping, and sort of the environmental sector, tree planting, that sort of thing, getting us to consider curlews within the landscape. All the sectors actually in NGOs, environmentalists, the gamekeeping sector as well. So I think we're all working towards one thing. And one thing I would say is what's come out of that is smaller community action groups who are all trying to do their bit to help within their own landscape. So I'd be thinking like me and another guy in Malmdale have started the Malmdale Curlew project, and we're primarily a surveying project. So we go onto farms, we've got 18 volunteers, we're looking at numbers of pairs and then feeding into statistics about breeding success. So that's one small area to start with. There are bigger groups in the area which are supported by, say, RSPB and BTO. One is the Clapham Curlew cluster near us. There's South Lakeland, there's Nidderdale, and a lot of these groups are going further. So if a farmer finds a nest on their land, there would be a say fence erected to protect the nest from predation. There might be a payment there for to leave a large area and some area safe area for chicks. So there might be a payment to compensate for the loss of some of that silage at that particular time. So there's those local ways of looking at it, but then there's also the big strategic way of looking at it. So if you're lucky enough to be in a national landscape or a national park like us, there's usually a brilliant farm team somewhere where you can go for advice. They will look at your farm as a whole. If you have breeding wader sites on your land, they can factor that into environmental stewardship. So yeah, I think there's a few ways of looking at it. And nationally, we have organisations like in Wales, Curlew Connections, Curlew Life in Northumberland and Ireland. Everywhere there is now things really strategically happening. And the Curlew Recovery Partnership heads that all up with lots of leading NGO partners. So yeah, I think there are things you can do. And if you're lucky enough to live in an area with curlews, there's probably something happening. So look into it and try and find out if you're interested in helping.
Meet the Farmers is brought to you by RuralPod Media, the only podcast production agency to specialise in the rural sector. We're on a mission to make rural stories mainstream and help businesses, organisations, and communities like you tell your story through podcasting. Podcasting is a fantastic way of connecting with your audience, whoever that might be, getting your message out there and networking with leaders in your niche. RuralPod Media can help you by launching your new podcast or helping you with the technical side. We also provide podcast training and an audit service if you already have a podcast. You're not sure where to take it to next. For more information or to book a call, visit ruralpodmedia.co.uk. That's ruralpodmedia.co.uk. Let's move to the part of the show where we talk about more general challenges and opportunities in agriculture. And you can talk about this in whatever context you want. What for you, Leigh, are the biggest challenges for you as a farm business?
I think everyone would say the weather, wouldn't they? And and I think the weather events we're seeing are no longer sort of wow, the once in a lifetime event. They're just becoming normal. And I think having some resilience against weather events, having a system that has resilience built into it, is a really important thing. I think that's a challenge. And I think over the years, hopefully, we have built some resilience into our system because we're not relying on inputs. So if fertilizer and concentrate feed goes up, that would have been a headache for us 15 years ago. Because of how we farm now, we're not in that system and it doesn't really matter anymore. Our biggest pressure time is probably like March to May when we're waiting for spring to happen and we're waiting for grass to go and we've got cattle outside. So it's just having a grazing plan, thinking, right, let's judge it every single year because it changes every single year. Where do those cows need to be? We don't want them to do any harm to the land. So where do they need to be? Within the business, the challenge is we took ourselves out of the commodities game, taking animals to market and the vagaries of how that goes up and down. And I think that there's a challenge in finding buyers and the right buyers who are in tune with what you do when you start producing something that is outside the norm, like, a lamb that is ready at a certain time because you've put X number of kilos of cake into it, it's going to be ready at that time, it's going to be weight. It's a more regimented product. When you start grazing a pasture-based system, we're organic as well. When you start doing something different and you have to graze animals longer to get them to the right weights, we don't want to be beholden to anybody sort of, I suppose, saying you must do this to get this animal for this time. So it's having faith in our system and having the conversations to find people who are in tune, who want naturally reared, high welfare, pasture for life certified cattle from the hills. So that in itself, I suppose, is a challenge, but it's something that we have managed to do, and we're always keen to forge new relationships with buyers, butchers, all sorts of people who are doing different things. So yeah, I think that is a challenge because suddenly you're not just taking everything to market, you let it go and off it goes. You never see it again and you start again. It's a very different thing. So I think that is a challenge.
Let's bring it back to the Dales. And I suppose in terms of we've already mentioned, we've sort of glanced over the change of the uplands landscape generally in terms of tree planting, in terms of sheep, in terms of cattle. How do you see the landscape of the Dales changing in future? Do you think we'll be looking at a similar landscape in a couple of decades' time, or do you think there'll be changes?
I think there will be some changes. I'm not convinced it'll be radical. I think the whole tree planting conversation is moving on apace. And I think even 5 years ago, I almost felt like people were panicking about, the climate carbon issue. I think it's easy to look at the Dales and think that it's obviously largely treeless, and there's a certain amount of trees that will grow in our upland soils, and there's not always a lot of soil. And it's really easy to think it's just this treeless kind of place. But again, I only speak for our farm. I wouldn't want to undertake a massive tree planting scheme on our farm, as great as trees are and as habitat, but because I would definitely impact on our ground nesting birds. That whole concept of the right tree in the right place has now come to fruition, and people are having more realistic conversations about the best places to put trees. So I think we will see more trees, and there are a few upland schemes in the Dales where there are tree planting proposals, but I don't think we're suddenly going to see it massive forestation. I think what we might see is a few more trees, and maybe we'll start seeing some longer swards, not as much hard grazed land like we've seen in the past, like our farm used to be. I think we maybe will see a little bit more growth, but I don't think we're going to see anything hugely drastic change. I don't think. Just on tree, can I just say something on trees? I am really supportive of trees, and I wouldn't want to seem anti-trees because trees in themselves are obviously brilliant for loads of reasons, especially habitat and the life they can support. It's just that here, when the uplands can be quite a special place for, like, our habitat is limestone grassland, which in itself is now a really fragmented habitat globally. So we have to be protective of that as well, where we have really special grasslands and birds who nest in them. We have to be really protective of that as well.
So, what would you say to younger farmers, prospective new entrants to farming, to reassure them as to the future of the industry?
I think there's always going to be a future because people need to eat, and we need to remember that. And I think we need the talent and ambition of new entrants to move things forward. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to keep on doing what we're doing and keep farming the way we are, simply from a level, the pressure of the weather and climate change is creating unpredictable weather that is now unfortunately becoming predictable. It's warmer and wetter, and we're just getting more and more rain. And I think we have to find a way through that. And I think we need new entrants to find a way through that and farm in a way which is producing food, but is also taking the other things into account. I think there's going to be an expectation from governments and from the public that we do the right thing and that we can provide public goods and services like habitat, flood measures, all of these things within a producing landscape. And hopefully that's not impossible. I think organisations like Pasture for Life, Nature Friendly Farming Network are proving that it's possible. And I'd also say that it's hard to get into farming. We know that it's a challenge, But if you can't get into it, don't feel like you have to do things the way they've always been done. If you need to find a system for your farm that works financially, and nature is part of that, and we've found personally that the more we farm with nature, the more profitable we've become. And that's not just about stewardship. The cattle are, the cattle and sheep are now profitable in their own right as well. Make your own direction with it. Find a system for you, and it might pull in funding sources from all over the place, as well as supplementing your life. So what are you doing? But don't be frightened of changing from the previous generation. And actually, probably we've gone backwards. We've gone back to farming like Neil's maybe great granddad did or granddad. So yeah, but don't be afraid of change because it's sometimes an exciting and quite liberating thing.
And finally, what does the future of your farm look like? More of the same? Are you going to shift things up at all?
Um, I think it'll be largely the same. I think we see so much value in managing habitat alongside food production. So for us, it is a big deal. And we have been very lucky that the payment structure that's been in place in terms of HLS and countryside stewardship has been for us a very, very valuable thing. And it's allowed us to produce amazing beef and the cows are profitable in their own right. I'm not saying they could necessarily be a wage for both of us, but with stewardship payments as well, we can have a really sensible income. We can produce nutrient dense food, which is organic and pasture fed. And alongside that, the cows are doing this amazing thing, managing and creating habitat for things like curlews. So I don't think we'll move and stray too far from that. We've been lucky to work with some amazing landlords and partners in that in terms of grazing. So long may that continue. Though I think fundamentally we'll have to retire at some point and give somebody else a turn, maybe. So I think it would be exciting to think in the future. And I mean, Neil does the large part of the physical graft in this relationship, and I'm a lot of the mouthpiece, I suppose, and a lot of the other stuff that goes on. But it's very much a joined up thinking partnership. But at some point, it would be exciting to think maybe if and when retirement comes, there's an opportunity on our farm for somebody else. And that's something to think about for the future, I think. So yeah, that's probably along the lines of where we'll be thinking. But I can't see Belter Galloways leaving the hills on this farm very quickly. They're just amazing animals, and we love having them.
Yeah, Leigh, thank you so much for telling us about the farm and the business. It's been great having you on. Before you go, we are going to do the quick questions and the final questions. So the first don't really have anything to do with farming. The first is if you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be and why?
Do they have to be famous?
No, they don't at all.
I would have dinner with the man who built our house in 1617.
Oh,
And
great.
I don't know what I said in the intro, but I my degree is actually in historic building conservation. So I've
Okay.
worked with historic buildings. My last job before I sort of retired into a farming life was at York City Council, and I was dead lucky to work with all the historic buildings there. And our house was built by a yeoman called William Preston in 1617. And there's loads of things I'd love to ask him about our house, and I'd love to see how it worked when it was built because it's had lots of alterations and additions and things done from a vernacular architecture perspective. I'd love to chat all things house with William Preston.
Yeah, this is a massive tangent, but I'm intrigued to this because actually working with historic buildings in York, especially, how long were you doing that role? And
Well, it
did
was
you were there any
actually
particular buildings that you worked with? Were there a bit of a
it
wow?
was it was quite before that. I'd been at Newark and Sherwood District Council in North Nottinghamshire, and I was there for longer. I was actually at York for a relatively short space of time. I had to leave to have brain surgery, which was a whole big other issue, but
Gosh.
it sort of ended quite abruptly, which was sad for me. But York is an amazing city and it has a huge, huge stock of listed buildings and huge conservation areas. There's too many buildings to choose from, but if you go to any of the shops on Stonegate, that's pretty much all grade two star and grade one listed. It's so historic. Yeah, it's an amazing, amazing city. So yeah, just all of York is just brilliant. But some of those timber framed houses dating to, centuries and centuries ago are just a joy to work with.
Yeah, I bet that was amazing. It is a beautiful city. The second one, is there anything on your bucket list that you haven't yet done?
Yeah, I thought about this, but I'm not sure I have a age 48. I'm not sure I have a bucket list yet. And maybe I need to start I sort of bumble through life, and maybe I need to start having a bucket list of things I absolutely have to do. But one of them, I think I'd like to go to the southern states and go to Nashville. I'm
Okay.
really like massively into music, and just to go to Nashville and the culture around the music and Nashville, New Orleans, some of those southern states, I think would be massively interesting. So yeah, I'd love to do that.
Oh, you should totally do that trip. That sounds
Have you done it?
fantastic. No, I haven't, and that's a bit again. It would be something I would love to do as well. It's yeah, that's a great
Yeah,
shout.
I think it would be dead interesting. So yeah, I'd love to do that.
And the final one, and this doesn't have to be the curlew. I know we've been talking about curlews today, and it doesn't even need to be a wetland bird. But what is your favorite bird?
It is the curlew, unsurprisingly, but I just love it so much. It's so sort of exotic with its long beak and its big, tall, long legs. And when you see it in the fields, and like I spend a huge amount of my life talking and thinking about this bird, and then when I actually see it for real, I'm like, oh my God, there it is. It's just so amazing to see it. They are just absolutely amazing birds. But I do have to give a massive shout out for blackbirds who I just absolutely love being near. They're so expressive and so furtive, and um, I love them. And we have them in the garden, and they even come in the house sometimes, and they're just ever present. And I feel like they're just friends around us. And then the
Yeah.
thrush family, I love all the thrushes, missel and song thrush, which we have right next to us on the farm, always singing. But some of those winter visitors, the redwings, the field fares, all of those, just massively. I love those birds so much. I'm always out trying to hunt them out in winter, looking for hawthorn berries and rowans. So yeah, love them, absolutely love them.
And we'll move on to the final questions. Lee, if you had a message for the public, any message, what would it be?
Oh, it feels a bit weighty when you start sort of having a message because I don't know whether I'm a person, I feel a bit like, oh, people are going to listen to me, but it's more, uh, don't underestimate your power as a buyer of things, of meat, of vegetables, of whatever. We get told all the time how much profit, how many billions supermarkets are making and other companies, and make them accountable for your money. They could do so much more good than they're doing in terms of their place in how the landscape's managed. And I want there to be fairness for everything, including farmers. And I just think don't ever underestimate your value of your money and what you're doing with it. And
And
also just try and keep your dogs on a lead and keep on footpaths during the bird nesting season. I absolutely love dogs and I have been a dog owner, and just on our land, some of it's open access. We have a lot of footpaths, and trying to encourage people to keep the dogs on a lead because there could be stuff living in the grass like curlews nesting that they can't see. So they might think, oh, there's no sheep in the field, I'll let my dog off. And suddenly they've flushed a curlew off a nest. So just being mindful of when you're entering a landscape, there's things living there that you might not be able to see. And even though you mean no harm, your dog, if it's lots of meters away from you, it might disturb something.
yeah, we haven't had that message for quite a while, actually. That's a good one to add back in, I think. And your message to farmers.
I'm not going to deny anyone. There's lots of people farming in lots of different ways, and people have their own systems that some of them are very tightly in that system, and it's hard to break out just because of the level of investment or the contract they have to fulfill. I'd say if someone wants to move in a more nature-led direction, don't dismiss agri-environment schemes. They are prescriptive and I think they're complex, but if you can get through that, get assistance with that, they can provide very, very useful income. And they can maybe allow, if you gain some income from it, you may have to sell some stock. But that financial gain can just allow you some breathing space to decide what the next step is if you want to move and transition away from a system that is no longer profitable or is no longer working for you as a family or as a farm. It took us a long time to let go of sheep, and we transitioned from 800 sheep to now we got to 600, then 400. And there was a point where it all became profitable. And I think it's finding that point and using agreement schemes to gain the benefit to nature and wildlife on your land, but also gain that income and breathing space possibly. Farming within natural processes and without expensive inputs has been better for our livestock because they're not out competing each other. It's better for us as a farm business and a family. And it's just better for the wildlife that lives on our farm and what we have the space to provide habitats and manage habitats. And that's been a really brilliant, fulfilling thing for us as well.
Leigh, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on. And also, it's just been a pleasure talking about curlews. So thank you for telling us about those and profiling them.
No problem at all. And you can have ours back when they've nested and hopefully fledged some chicks and they head back to the wash or anywhere else at the coast back in July, August time. So, yeah,
Yeah, we'll look forward to it. That is it for today. A big thank you to my guest, Leigh Weston, for coming on the show. Thank you very much for listening. Please share this episode on your socials. I hope it will spark some conversations about curlews as well. Next time, we'll be heading back over the pond to the United States to meet another US farmer. Don't forget to check out our sister show, Rural Business Focus. You can find that wherever you are listening to this show. I'll be back with you next week. But for now, I'm Ben Eagle. This has been Meet the Farmers, and thank you very much for listening.